Hello again to our weekly online Bible class from Pine Valley Church of Christ. And we are continuing our look at the letter of Paul to the churches in Galatia, the place where he and Barnabas had gone on their first missionary journey. And they have returned from that. There's been some problems with Judaizers in Antioch itself, which Paul has had to deal with. They may actually be on their way or preparing to go to the conference in Jerusalem to discuss how the Gentiles should be handled in terms of keeping the law and circumcision and so forth. And preparing for that, which we see in Acts chapter 15. But we have, you can tell there's a great urgency in Paul's writing. He wants to make sure that he tries to head off this situation. And we're coming to learn more and more about what is his concern. And we're going to see that today in chapter 5. Let me get our screen share up. And as we have described this series as new wineskins, I go back to that parable told by Jesus, and we see the very thing happening there that Jesus warns against, which is trying to bring something new, life in the Spirit, faith in Jesus Christ, into something old, the Torah, the law of Moses, old traditions and ways of life, and trying to hang on to those and even make them require them of others. And he says it just doesn't fit. And that's been Paul's point throughout this letter so far. He ended chapter 4 reminding them of all who are followers of Jesus Christ by faith are children of Abraham, and not just those who are of a physical descent. And he began chapter 5 with, "It is for freedom that Christ has set you free. So stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by the yoke of slavery. He has set you free to be free, to be free to depend on the righteousness of Jesus Christ himself." But he's going to go on to define just exactly what that freedom is, as we see in our lesson today, as we're going to pick up in verse 2 and following. But we're going to see a emphasis here on Paul. They need to immerse themselves. He's already talked about their baptism. And when they're baptized into Christ, they have been clothed with him. And this is what it means. This is the immersed life that he is going to spend more time discussing here in chapter 5 and in our next lesson in chapter 6. It is something they must give themselves to completely. And so he begins with a warning in the first few verses of chapter 5, beginning verse 2. "Mark my words, I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all. Again, I declare that every man who lets himself be circumcised, that he is obligated to obey the whole law. You who are trying to be justified by law have been alienated from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. But by faith we eagerly await through the Spirit the righteousness for which we hope. But in Christ Jesus neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love." Rather drastic warning. And we can see that there's been pressure put on these early Gentile Christians to conform, especially to circumcision, maybe the dietary laws and some other things from the Old Testament law. But the focus on circumcision as a sign of that you truly are a true Christian. And he says, no, when you do that, you have said that faith in Jesus Christ is not enough. So in other words, Christ is of no benefit to you because you are invalidating his entire life and ministry. And you are then obligated to keep the entire law, and you are obligated to keep it perfectly if you want to please God, which no individual person can. The only one who ever did was Jesus Christ. In fact, he says, you have now alienated yourself from Christ. Notice he doesn't say Christ has left you, you have left him. You have alienated yourself and have fallen from grace. Now, I know there are some in the Christian world that will tell you that once you are saved by putting your faith in Jesus, that you cannot fall from grace. And yet that's exactly what this verse says, and is backed up by the entire book of Hebrews, that you can fall from grace. Why? Because faith, we are saved by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. And if we remove our faith in him and make it into something that we earn, we fall from grace. We lose that connection, which is so important for us to hang on to. And he says, but those of us who are eagerly waiting by faith are doing so through the Spirit, through faith and hope, for the righteousness that comes from God himself, not what we do and not what we earn. And he says, what really matters is faith expressing itself through love. And here's something that is hard for us to understand. And John mentions this in his first letter, that we love because he first loved us. He has shown us love. He talks about it extensively in the upper room in John 13 through 17 with his disciples. It is, but it's something we accept. It's not something we earn. It's not something that we need to continue going through our spiritual life, thinking that we need to continue to earn. But we accept it, just like we accept the grace of God by putting our faith in Jesus Christ. And then we respond to it. And those are two totally different approaches. The one that seeks to earn it is seeking self-righteousness, which cannot save us. The one who responds to it is living by faith. That is faith working through love. And this is an important concept that he is going to build on in the following verses. So he issues the challenge to them. And throughout this paragraph, there's these interesting connections in the Greek with the idea of cut, or the idea of circumcision in a person's life. You were running a good race. Who cut in on you and kept you from obeying the truth? That kind of persuasion does not come from the one who calls you. The little yeast works through the whole batch of dough. I am confident in the Lord that you will take no other view. The one who's throwing you into confusion will pay the penalty, whoever he may be. Brothers, if I'm still preaching circumcision, then why am I being persecuted? In that case, the offense of the cross has been abolished. As for those agitators, I wish they would go the whole way and emasculate themselves. But you were called to be free. Again, going back to the very same words he uses in verse 1 of chapter 5. But here's the challenge. You've let someone cut in on you and wanting to force you to do, and it's obvious from what he says that some may have already been circumcised. Others are at least considering it. And there's a great struggle going on within the Christian community in these cities in southern Galatia. But he says, all it has done is preventing you from being persuaded by the truth, and continuing to be persuaded by that and responding to it and living by it in your life, and warns them the danger of a little leaven. Maybe a reference to the Old Testament or the Torah festival of Passover, where a part of that was to go throughout the house before the Passover began and to remove all the leaven, because that was part of the story. is that the bread they ate that night was unleavened because they did not have time to allow it to rise. And Jesus uses this same kind of imagery. Little leaven, he warns his disciples against the leaven of the Pharisees and the scribes and teachers. It can get inside of you. And that's the same thing these guys are doing, and can then end up leavening the entire thing rather than just a small part. And we have to be aware of that. And he's so frustrated with this particular group, referring to them as individuals who are stirring up trouble, those who the one throwing you into confusion. They're going to be the ones who pay the penalty for all this. And he says, I just wish they'd go all the way. They would emasculate themselves rather than just the cutting off of the foreskin of the male, cut off or castrate themselves completely. That would be the logical end of the arguments that they are pushing in their lives. And that gives you just an idea of how frustrated Paul is with this whole situation. And he's going to help us better understand it now in the rest of the chapter. As he says, you are called to be free. Do not use your freedom to indulge the sinful nature. Rather, serve one another in love. The entire law is summed up in a single command. Love your neighbor as yourself. If you keep on biting and devouring each other, watch out, or you will be destroyed by each other. So I say, live by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the sinful nature. For the sinful nature desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the sinful nature, or the flesh. They are in conflict with each other, so that you do not do what you want. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under law. It says, yes, you've been set free. It's not set free to do anything that you want, including the way in which they treat each other, not to indulge in the sinful nature, rather serve one another in love. Again, law summed up in the love your neighbor as yourself. He says you're free to love others, not indulge yourself. And that's what he's going to discuss when he talks about the works of the flesh versus the fruits of the Spirit. He says, but if you keep on biting and devouring each other, watch out or you'll be destroyed by each other. And we get a true sense here. It's very easy for us, especially when we get into the works of the flesh, just to consider the people in the world, the way in which they live their lives, and the immorality that is out there. But there's more to it than that. It's not just a contrast between Christians and the world outside. It is also a condemnation of those within the church, which are trying to divide it and cause these divisions that are happening. And that is brought out in verse 15, and it comes out again in verse 26. He talks about biting and devouring yourselves. Watch out or you're destroyed by each other. And after talking about the fruits of the Spirit and all these wonderful, beautiful things, let us not become conceited, provoking and envying each other. It says, it seems to be an indication. This is what's going on within this Christian community. Allowing own personal wants and desires to get in the way and lead them into a potential danger of devouring each other, or causing there to be destruction of faith in some people's lives, splitting of the fellowship in others. And these are simply things that cannot be. And as I've said in the past, unity, the unity and love that the people of Jesus are to have for each other is the most discussed subject in the New Testament. And we tend not to treat it like that, and continue to focus on things at times that actually divide us rather than bringing us together. So he says, give yourself to the Spirit. It's going to be in conflict with what's in the flesh. And he's going to show us that difference as we move along. So he says, let's talk about the works of the flesh, or the acts of the flesh. And it's interesting the different way in which he describes it. These are things we give ourselves to. We work at them because we decide that's what we want to do. The works of the flesh are obvious: sexual immorality, impurity, debauchery, idolatry, and witchcraft, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, and envy, drunkenness, orgies, and the like. I warn you, as I did before, that those who live like this will not inherit the kingdom of God. First statement is interesting. These kinds of things are obvious, that these are works of the flesh. Doesn't matter whether you are a Jew, whether you're a Gentile Christian, or whether you're a person in the world. It is obvious that these things are things that tear people's lives apart and tear people apart from each other. And I want us to notice now sort of the two groups that are being discussed here, where we have, sexual immorality, impurity, what we could translate as promiscuity, idolatry, sorcery, drunkenness, carousing, and the like. And in other words, throwing that in there to help us better understand. And wanted to take some time to look at these a little more closely than we did on Sunday in our lesson. But for sexual immorality, or fornication, the general term for all sexual contact outside of a marriage relationship. It is seeking totally for self. Impurity or uncleanness indicates a kind of behavior that makes us dirty or impure, which there were lots of things in the Old Testament law which caused people to be impure or unclean, and therefore could not enter into temple worship. And that was true in the Gentile worship of idols as well. Impurity, or promiscuity or licentiousness, moves it, referring to the kind of behavior that has cast off normal restraint and control. And then he moves into two that would have been extremely important to the Jewish Christians, and seeing this as a real source of a problem in the community if the people involve themselves in idolatry and worship of other gods and sorcery or witchcraft. They are laying themselves open to inviting dark powers other than the one true God into their lives. Those dark powers, which he emphasized back in the very beginning of chapter 1, that Jesus has set us free from. So we can't go back into it and invite those same powers into our life. Now, we'll add, as I did on Sunday, the word for sorcery is, in Greek, is the word from which we get pharmacy or pharmaceuticals. And it is believed that in the ancient world, a part of controlling other people's lives and helping them be controlled was through the use of drugs that would cause illusions, visions, whatever, in people's lives. And this is something that is so prevalent in our world today still, whether it's illegal drugs, whether it is the misuse of prescription drugs, whether it is just become something, even seeking relief from pain has become something that has taken over people's lives and causing them a great deal of problems. And it's also going to do that same thing in our spiritual life, because if we're giving ourselves to that, we're not giving ourselves to the power of the Spirit to work in our life. Skipping on down to the end, he talks about, the drunkenness and the carousing. And he said, this is, again, the things that you give yourself to that you think are so special and important, but They again are just talking about you know, drunkenness, that it is a regular practice. It's plural. Drunkenness is this something somebody gives their life to, carousing or wild partying, something that gives the illusion of we're in a group and there is a good social contact and activity, and all it does is can take us down a very dark hole in our lives. But in between sorcery and those final two, drunkenness and carousing, there are these 8 terms which all have to do with relationships with other people. Hatred, strife, jealousy, rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, and jealousy. And it's hatred can be also hostilities. It's one that any kind of conflict or even a full-scale war between nations, it can be used in the ancient world. Strife is the state of angry and perhaps violent discord that results. Jealousy is personal eagerness, and has a fierce partisanship in a disputed area. In other words, I'm always right, you're always wrong. There's a change here in when we come to rage and selfish ambition, and all these things become plural instead of singular. Burst of rage, moments when the smoldering dissension bursts forth like a flame. Selfish ambition, again plural, people looking chances to better themselves at the expense of others. Factiousness or dissensions, the tendencies for different personalities to grab onto some particular feature of life and huddle together with those who are like-minded and demonize all those who do not agree with them. Divisions or factions is a settled or established group who have broken away from the rest, probably from the dissensions and the selfish ambition that has already taken over their lives. And finally, the jealousy or moods of envy, as a general state of which someone may be taken over by a gnawing resentment against someone else. All of these things have to do with relationships with other people, whether they are within the Christian community or whether it's with those who are in the world. And he wants them to come to a final understanding of, this is how serious this is. People who practice these things, who have given themselves to them, even within the Christian community, they will never enter the kingdom of God. And I wanted to pull that second group out by itself because it's very easy for us. And I know a number of people within the Christian community are very vocal about the first list and under number 2. And, we can have nothing to do with this, and that's good and that's fine. And yet, while they're very vocal against those things, they go on and practice themselves some of that in the list number 3. And I've seen it happen so many times where people come into conflict with one another because it's matters of opinion. There are differences of personality, and there is, and so much of the time, it is about selfish ambition. Who is going to be in control? Forgetting that Jesus is the one who is in control, and we are to give ourselves to him and allow his Spirit to control us and not seek things for our own ambition, our own wants, to prove we are right and everybody else is wrong, but a spirit of humility, which is what is described when we come to the fruit of the Spirit. It's a totally different setup. where the works of the flesh are all about me, the fruit of the Spirit is about putting God and others first. But the fruit, or we can even say harvest there, of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law. Those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the sinful nature with its passions and desires. Since we live by the Spirit, let us keep in step with the Spirit, and let us not become conceited, provoking each other, or envying each other. This is about others, first and foremost. Yes, it affects us in terms of love is something we give, but we also then can receive. Joy is something that is within us, but we share with others. Peace, patience, all of these things, we tend to want to, boil them down to just, personal characteristics. He says, no, this is about also your life in community with each other. And the Spirit can truly work when there are these characteristics or these fruits of the Spirit that are present in your life. And I've heard people ask over the years, well, I know people who have all of these characteristics in their life, but they're not believers. How can that be? Is, the Spirit working in them? Well, these are good things. Many people seek them in their life. But until they are controlled by the Spirit and given over to Him, they cannot become all that they could be. And they then become the fruit of the Spirit. And again, even the word fruit, we tend to think of as, the Spirit does this, I don't really have to work at it. No, fruit is something you work for. You cultivate, you fertilize, you do all the things to help get rid of the old self so that the Spirit can take more and more control throughout our lives. And he says, and it doesn't matter whether it's the Old Testament law or whether it's Roman law. There are no law against these such things. These are good things. And everybody recognizes them as that. And it's made possible by the fact that you have crucified the flesh and live by the Spirit. Again, the contrast with flesh. You've crucified it. You've gotten rid of it. You've died through baptism into the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus Christ, and now live by the Spirit. And so he says, since this is the case, let's keep in step. It could literally be translated, get in line, follow the Spirit wherever He leads us. And especially in terms of how we relate to each other within the community of Christ. Because this is the greatest witness we can give the world around us, is how we get along with each other, which is something Jesus emphasized greatly. That here, these wonderful, passionate, powerful things that can work in people's lives when we give them and ourselves all over to the guidance of the Spirit and walk in line or in step with Him in the way of Jesus Himself, who told His disciples, a new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. It takes loving your neighbor as yourself beyond just about me and that person, but thinking about the sacrifice, the total giving of self that Christ did for us. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. In the very next verse, he says, and this is how everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another in this way. And that is Paul's greatest concern here in his letter to the Galatians about what he hears going on, because it has led to dispute, arguments, struggle, dissensions, and selfish ambition. leading to these arguments based on you must agree with me no matter what. I know what's best, rather than focusing on the teachings and the example of Jesus himself. He's going to continue with that same avenue of thought as we go into chapter 6, which we'll look at in our next lesson, as he shows them again what it is to live by the Spirit and what it means to their relationships, not only to the world, but to each other, and the importance of it to our Christian fellowship with one another. So I appreciate you sharing this time with me today. We will be back next week with looking at chapter 6, and look forward to spending that time with you as he starts to bring everything to a conclusion. And even after we look at chapter 6 next week, we're going to take 1 week just to go back and look at the big picture of the whole thing and help tie it all together in this powerful letter that reminds us the importance of demonstrating faith through love. Let us each seek to do so every day of our lives.